Joining us to discuss what's coming up in 2015 is Simon Marks, the president and chief correspondent for the international broadcast news agency Feature Story News. And from Los Angeles is Cenk Uygur, host and co-founder of the online news show The Young Turks. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Cenk, let's go to you and start in the Middle East. It never seems to stop in the Middle East. More instability this past year, more violence. 2014 also saw the full emergence of a group known as ISIL or ISIS or IS, call it what you will. How has that changed the Middle East?
Just when you thought things couldn't get any worse, the Middle East has found a way to make it worse. But look, the U.S. has contributed greatly to that. We, of course, started the Iraq War, and at the time we said Al-Qaeda was the biggest problem, although, of course, Al-Qaeda had absolutely nothing to do with Iraq. Well, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, and here comes not only Al-Qaeda out of Iraq and then Syria, but now a group worse than Al-Qaeda. ISIS has been disowned by Al-Qaeda. Now the new Taliban attack in Pakistan, Al-Qaeda says it makes their heart sick. When you've got terrorist groups out there that make Al-Qaeda's heart grow weary, wow, we're in a world of trouble here. And so we opened up a Pandora's box, and in 2014, a lot of things poured out of that box.
Simon, in 2015, is ISIL going to be there to stay, or are we going to see an escalating war, more U.S. troops moving to the region?
Well, there's certainly no indication that Islamic State is going to disappear. I mean, that Pandora's box is well and truly open. It is a Pandora's box, something of the Obama administration's creation. I mean, there is much evidence to suggest that a different policy, particularly towards the moderate Syrian opposition, particularly a more muscular approach towards developing the Iraqi government forces during 2012, 2013 may have prevented some of the difficulties that arose in 2014, but we are now undoubtedly as a society very much stuck with them. And while the US-led coalition will presumably continue trying to defeat Islamic State from the air, going into 2015, it's still very unclear what the ground strategy is if, as President Obama continues to maintain, he's not going to put what he refers to as boots on the ground, combat boots on the ground, even though you've already got 4,000 US troops on the ground in Iraq. So, look, this story clearly not disappearing in 2015, and I fear we'll see more of the horrors in 2015 that we all witnessed in the last 12 months.
I really want to say yes and no to your question there, which is President Obama partly responsible for this ISIS group growing? Yes, but not in the ways that I think that you stated. I mean, look, people blame him for not helping the so-called moderate Syrian rebels. There's no way there's anybody that's moderate in Syria. I mean, there are, but unfortunately they're disempowered completely. So the idea isn't that more war is going to work. The problem that President Obama has is that he continued the Bush administration policy of keeping that war machine humming. He says he got us out of Iraq, but all of a sudden we're back in Iraq, and now we're also in Syria, so we've kind of doubled that up. And he says we're getting out of Afghanistan, but he issued a secret order saying that we'll actually increase our troops in Afghanistan next year. So there's plenty to blame President Obama for, but the main problem is continuation of this war machine that isn't working. It's not that he didn't do enough of that earlier.
Simon, let's move on to the other big issue in the Middle East, the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians. We saw that big Gaza war this past year, up to 2,000 Palestinian civilians killed. Are we going to see anything like a move towards resolving this in the coming year? I mean, we are now seeing some opposition to Israel coming from people who are traditionally considered its allies. Even here in the United States, there's been criticism coming from
but I just don't think there's very much grounds for optimism looking forward into 2015. First of all, everything is going to be paralyzed by the Israeli general election, which is going to take place in March. So that puts everything on hold through until at least March and potentially thereafter, depending on what sort of coalition gets put together in Israel. And at the end of the day, you know, the United States and the other members of the quartet can devote as much time as they like to trying to advance advance what I suppose loosely one still refers to as the peace process. But for as long as the United States is not talking, for example, to Hamas, is only talking to Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority, hard to see what concrete achievements you can notch up. Secretary of State John Kerry clearly wants to be the Secretary of State who goes down in history being the man who brokered Middle East peace. I'm afraid that I think he's going to be very disappointed.
Okay, Cenk, I want to stay in the Middle East for one more thing, and that is what has come to be known as the Arab Spring. Is it now dead and buried, with perhaps the exception of Tunisia? Because in Egypt, we've seen it just go full circle.
Yeah, it most certainly did. And when they let Mubarak out of prison, it was basically rubbing it in people's faces like, hey, we're back. And who did you think you were kidding? No, it's the same guys, different face, that's the leadership now. But it really got quashed. I mean, I wish there were these moderate secular forces that were winning throughout the Middle East in the Arab Spring that we had hoped for. But it seems like the two forces we're mainly dealing with is either Muslim fundamentalism or, in the case of Egypt, more of a military regime that's back to its old tricks. So it has not worked well so far.
Simon, Afghanistan 2015, we're going to see more troops pulling out. What kind of an impact is that going to have, though? Will we see a resurgence of the Taliban?
I think it's highly likely that you will. I mean, we've already seen a resurgence of the Taliban in Pakistan. I think it's highly likely that you will. The Obama administration is putting enormous credibility in Ashraf Ghani, the new leader in Afghanistan, including the repatriation just over the last few days of some detainees from Guantanamo Bay. The administration saying this is a sign of confidence that Ashraf Ghani is no Hamid Karzai. But regardless of the personality involved here, there are fundamental issues on the ground that suggest that when U.S. troops pull out, the situation as far as the security of the Afghan people is concerned is by no means secure. They say that the status of forces agreement that they have struck will avoid some of the mistakes that the Obama administration did make on the way out of Iraq. That remains to be seen, and I suspect we'll all be covering that situation extensively over the next 12 months.
Okay, Cenk, let's get out of the Middle East. Let's go to the relationship between the United States and Russia. That has deteriorated considerably this past year over Ukraine. Can it get worse in the next year?
Of course! As we learned in 2014, things can always get worse. So I hope they don't. It's possible they're going to get better, and the main reason for that is the economic disaster in Russia. I think that it's going to, bring down their appetite for further conflict. So I hope that Putin begins to, pull back a little bit from that conflict. Now, by the way, Russia's not the only one at fault there. I mean, obviously, there was a democratically elected government there that basically got overthrown, and the Ukrainians have been very aggressive in their shelling of eastern Ukraine as they try to reclaim territory. So there's a lot of blame to go on both sides, but I think with the economy as it is in Russia, that might get closer to a resolution.
There is a lot more blame, though, to be placed on the Russian government than on anyone else in this situation. If any good news comes out of 2014 in this regard, it is that there is now, I think, common agreement here among U.S. policymakers that the era in which one could pretend that Vladimir Putin craved respectability on the world scene is over. The era in which a Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton at the time, could travel to Moscow and present Sergei Lavrov with that big shiny red reset button and suggest that everything going forward was going to be okay. That era is over, and I'm not convinced that Vladimir Putin is going to step back from the brink, regardless of the economic vicissitudes that he's facing. So much now hinges on the failure so far of the captains of Russian industry to feel strong enough to walk into his office and say, Mr. President, you are leading us to disaster. And unless that changes, that disaster will deepen in 2015.
And just real quick, I don't really disagree with you. I think the question there is exactly what you said at the end. Whether there's enough strength in the oligarchs of Russia to be able to say to Putin, we're losing too much money here, so you've got to stop your power grab. So that's the real conflict at play here, and that'll determine which direction they go.
Okay, Cenk, I'm going to stay with you, and we're going to come to the United States. Major protests over the past few weeks over, well, these are race issues, blacks and whites, more polarized than ever. Is that going to stay the same way? Is it going to get worse in 2015? Or are we going to see some major effort being made to repair this?
Well, the first step to any solution is recognizing the problem and the depths of the problem. So I think that we've begun to do that in 2014. So, for example, the number of people who thought race was the #1 issue in the country just jumped up from 1% a couple of months ago to 13% in America. So that's a huge jump up, and it's now among the leading issues in the country. And it's not like all these police abuse issues didn't exist before, and the bad relationship with the African-American community and the government and the police didn't exist before. It most certainly did. We're just now seeing it. And, you know, we've got the cameras, we've got the major issues that are popping up in the news. I hope, putting my optimistic hat on, that begins to shine a light that works some of these issues through, whether it's the federal government coming in and doing a review of the police departments, or those departments responding to public pressure.
Simon, politically, we are going to see one big change in 2015. The Republicans, the opposition in the United States, are going to take over both houses in Congress. That's the House of Representatives and the Senate. How big a change is that going to be?
It's a big change. It constrains further President Obama's ability to get things done. He hasn't proved to be a president who can work with a Congress where the Republicans were dominant in the House of Representatives but not in the Senate. Now they're going to be dominant in the Senate as well, and clearly one can fault both sides of the equation for that. There's no question about that. But it is going to force, I think, the president to do more of what you've just seen him doing over the last few weeks of the year. More executive actions where he has room for maneuver. We've seen it most recently, for example, over Cuba, throwing the gauntlet down to this new Congress and saying, right, what are you going to do about this trade embargo? Because I'm going to start letting banks have relationships with Cuban financial institutions, and we want people to travel there more easily. Are you going to see Congress picking that up as the 2016 election campaign starts revving up in the wings? How much of their capital are they going to want to spend battling President Obama over his legacy versus trying to find a candidate that they think they can run in 2016 to succeed him?
All right, we have 1 minute left. I'm going to give you guys 30 seconds each. What, in your view, Cenk first, is going to be the biggest story in 2015?
Well, whether President Obama decides that he's going to basically capitulate to the Republicans and give them everything that they want, including corporate tax cuts, maybe even cutting Social Security, Medicare, it's something that he's wanted to do all along, strike a grand bargain. And if he goes in that direction, it'll be a disaster for the American people. He'll get a pat on the back from the Washington elites, but it'll be a really bad turn for the country.
Simon.
I'm going to give you two. In the United States, by the end of 2015, does Hillary Clinton still look like the obvious Democratic Party candidate for 2016? I'm not convinced that she will. I also suggest everybody, naturally, keeps a very close eye on the election in Britain, which is going to tell you something about the rise of nationalism, not just in Britain, but in other parts of Europe as well.
Simon Marks, Cenk Uygur, thanks to both of you for joining us.